My name is Vanessa Morrison, and I'm 41 years old. I traveled nearly 10 hours to stand on this doorstep today, clutching a carefully wrapped package that had taken me weeks to prepare. I didn't expect a warm embrace or tearful reconciliation, but I did expect basic human decency. I expected to at least cross the threshold. Instead, the moment my foot touched the bottom step of that grand entrance, every fragile hope I'd carried with me shattered like dropped glass. My younger sister positioned herself in the doorway with the confidence of someone who'd been waiting for this exact moment. Her eyes met mine without flinching, and the words she spoke landed with surgical precision. She told me I was no longer part of this family. No apology in her voice, no hesitation. Just a statement delivered as casually as someone might comment on the weather. And there, framed in the golden light spilling from inside, stood the two people who brought me into this world. They didn't move. They didn't speak. They simply watched as if they were observing something inevitable and unremarkable. As if my decade of trying to remain connected had been nothing more than background noise they'd finally decided to silence. I didn't cry. I didn't raise my voice or demand an explanation, because honestly, the truth was already there, in the space between us. I had been written out of their story long before today. This moment was just them finally saying it aloud, making official what had been true for years. So I turned away from that door, from that house, from those people. I walked back down the stone pathway, with the gift still in my hands, and something cold and heavy settling in my chest where warmth used to live. They thought closing that door would end things. They believed their rejection would be the final word. They had no idea what I carried with me in my bag, on my laptop, in the files I'd been safeguarding for years. Within 2 hours, the elegant celebration happening behind those closed doors would begin to crumble in ways none of them could have predicted. But before I tell you how everything unraveled and what happened after I walked away from that house, I want to pause for just a moment. If you feel my words, show your support by liking the video and subscribing to the channel. And tell me from which city you belong, so I can see how far a woman's impactful voice can reach. Help me build this community so we can bring more truthful stories for you. Your presence here matters more than you might realize, and I'm grateful you're listening. Now, let me take you back to where this really began. Life inside the Morrison household never matched the picture we presented to the outside world. My parents built Morrison Premier Events from the ground up, starting with a single venue in downtown Seattle and expanding over 2 decades into a network of elegant spaces throughout Washington state. They hosted everything from high-profile weddings to corporate galas, and their reputation for sophistication and attention to detail made them the go-to choice for anyone wanting to make an impression. In public, they were the power couple featured in local business magazines, speaking at entrepreneurship panels, and sponsoring community fundraisers. At home, the reality was far less glossy. The unspoken hierarchy was brutally simple. Your value was determined by how useful you were to Morrison Premier Events. My younger sister, Delilah, understood this from an early age. She attended client meetings as a teenager, learned the names of every vendor, and spoke about the business with a sense of ownership that our parents rewarded with attention and approval. I took a different path, one that should have been equally valued, but somehow never was. I excelled academically. I brought home report cards filled with high marks, particularly in mathematics and economics. My teachers told me I had a natural aptitude for financial analysis and encouraged me to pursue it professionally. When I shared this with my parents, they nodded politely and then asked how I planned to apply those skills to the family business. Every achievement I earned was measured not by its own merit, but by how it could serve Morrison Premier Events. When I mentioned wanting to work for a major accounting firm or perhaps start my own consulting practice, the response was always the same. Real success, they said, meant contributing to something established, something with the Morrison name attached to it. Independence was reframed as selfishness, and ambition outside the family structure was treated as betrayal. I remember being 22 years old and clearing my entire weekend for a company retreat. It was supposed to be a combination of strategic planning and family bonding at a resort near Mount Rainier. I packed my bags, drove to the meeting location, and found an empty parking lot. My phone buzzed with a text from Delilah, saying they decided to leave a day early, and figured I'd understand since I wasn't really involved in operations anyway. The casual cruelty of that message stayed with me for weeks. Then there was the grand opening of their flagship venue in Bellevue, a massive event covered by local news outlets. I learned about it from a Facebook post showing my parents and Delilah cutting a ribbon, while photographers captured the moment. My name had never been on the guest list. When I asked about it later, my mother said she assumed I'd be too busy with my own things to attend. The message was clear. I existed on the periphery of their world, close enough to be called family when convenient, but far enough to be excluded when it mattered. So I built a life that didn't require their validation. I finished my degree in accounting, passed my CPA exam on the first attempt, and opened a small practice focused on helping local businesses manage their finances. My parents called it a hobby, a phase I'd grow out of once I realized where the real opportunities were. But my clients appreciated my work. They valued my attention to detail and my commitment to ethical practices. Slowly, I built something that belonged entirely to me, something that didn't carry the weight of Morrison family expectations. For a few years, that separation felt like freedom. I attended occasional family dinners, exchanged polite updates, and maintained the appearance of connection without investing too deeply. Then my father called with a request that changed everything. Working with Morrison Premier Events had lost their senior accountant unexpectedly. The person had quit without much notice, leaving behind a mess of incomplete reports and unanswered questions. My father asked if I could step in temporarily to help sort things out. He framed it as an opportunity, a chance for me to finally prove my value within the business, and maybe even secure a permanent position if things went well. I hesitated. Part of me wanted to refuse, to maintain the boundaries I'd worked so hard to establish. But another part of me, the part that still hoped for my parents' approval, couldn't say no. I agreed to a 3-month contract, telling myself it was just a short-term project and that I could return to my own practice once it was done. I had no idea what I was about to uncover. The Morrison Premier Events office was located in a modern building with floor-to-ceiling windows and expensive furniture that screamed success. My desk was tucked into a corner of the finance department, surrounded by filing cabinets and stacks of documents that hadn't been properly organized in months. The first week was overwhelming. I spent long hours sorting through payroll records, expense reports, and client contracts, trying to make sense of a system that seemed deliberately opaque. And then I started noticing things, small inconsistencies at first. Hours on time cards that didn't match the events they were associated with. Overtime that appeared on preliminary reports, but vanished from the final version submitted to payroll. When I asked about it, I was told it was standard practice in the events industry. Employees were encouraged to round down their hours to keep labor costs manageable. It didn't sit right with me, but I was new to the internal operations, so I documented what I found and kept digging. The deeper I went, the worse it got. I found payroll records where staff had been asked to clock out before they finished setting up or breaking down events, even though they continued working for hours afterward. Notes in the system indicated this was done to avoid paying overtime, with supervisors pressuring employees to be team players and not make a fuss about a few extra unpaid hours here and there. It wasn't just unethical, it was illegal. Oh, what truly shocked me came when I started revealing the financial relief grants Morrison Premier Events had received during the pandemic and the economically unstable years that followed. Like many businesses, they'd applied for government assistance programs designed to help companies keep employees on payroll and cover essential operational costs. On paper, everything looked legitimate. The grant applications were well written, the documentation appeared thorough, and the approval amounts were substantial. But when I cross-referenced the grant funds with the company's internal ledgers, the numbers didn't match. Money that was supposed to go toward employee wages and essential expenses had been redirected. Tens of thousands of dollars had been transferred into secondary accounts and used for things that had nothing to do with the stated purpose of the grants. I found payments for luxury office renovations, executive travel that coincided with family vacations, and even personal expenses that had been creatively categorized as business costs. The more I uncovered, the clearer the pattern became. Morrison Premier Events had systematically misused relief funds meant to protect workers and keep the business afloat during a crisis. Instead, my parents and Delilah had treated that money as a personal windfall, funding a lifestyle that had no connection to the struggling business they'd claimed to be running. I sat at my desk one afternoon, staring at a spreadsheet that laid it all out in stark, undeniable terms, and felt something inside me shift. This wasn't just bad bookkeeping or aggressive accounting. This was fraud. I knew I needed to be careful. I began quietly saving copies of every relevant document I could access. Payroll summaries showing the unpaid hours, internal emails discussing strategies to minimize labor costs, grant applications alongside the internal ledgers that proved how the money had actually been spent. I told myself I was simply being thorough, that any good accountant would keep backups of important files. But the truth was, I knew I might need evidence if things went wrong. And things were absolutely about to go wrong. I requested a meeting with my father and the operations manager to discuss what I'd found. I prepared a summary, keeping my language neutral and professional. I framed it as a concern that needed to be addressed before it became a larger problem. I genuinely believed they might not have fully understood the implications of what they'd been doing, that perhaps with the right information, they'd take steps to correct it. Desperate, the meeting was held in a conference room with a view of the Seattle skyline. I presented my findings calmly, walking through the payroll issues first and then moving on to the grant discrepancies. As I spoke, the temperature in the room seemed to drop. My father's expression shifted from polite attention to something harder, more guarded. The operations manager, a man named Carl who'd been with the company for over a decade, leaned back in his chair with his arms crossed, his face unreadable. When I finished, there was a long silence. Then my father spoke. He thanked me for my diligence, but explained that I was misunderstanding standard industry practices. The payroll adjustments were minor corrections, he said, nothing out of the ordinary. As for the grant funds, he assured me that everything had been allocated appropriately, and that any apparent discrepancies were simply a matter of accounting categories that I wasn't familiar with yet. Carl backed him up, adding that external auditors had reviewed their books and found nothing problematic. He suggested I focus on learning the company's systems rather than jumping to conclusions based on incomplete information. The dismissal was polite but absolute. I left that meeting with a sick feeling in my stomach, knowing that they had no intention of addressing what I'd found. Worse, I realized they saw me as a threat. Over the following weeks, the atmosphere around me changed. Conversations stopped when I entered a room. Emails I used to be copied on no longer included me. When I asked questions, I received vague answers or was redirected to someone else. I was still introduced as family, still invited to company events, but the invisible wall between me and the rest of the organization grew thicker every day. It became clear that my temporary position was going to end exactly as planned, and that nothing I discovered would ever be acknowledged, let alone corrected. When my 3-month contract concluded, my father thanked me for my help and mentioned they'd hired someone with more experience in the hospitality industry to take over the accounting department permanently. There was no offer to stay on, no suggestion that my work had been valuable, just a polite goodbye and a reminder to submit my final time card. I returned to my own practice feeling like I'd been used and discarded, but also strangely relieved to be free of that toxic environment. I tried to move on, to focus on my own clients and rebuild the professional distance I'd briefly abandoned. But the files I'd saved sat on my laptop like a weight I couldn't ignore. I didn't know what to do with them. I didn't know if I should do anything at all. And then the invitation arrived. It came in the mail on a Thursday afternoon, printed on thick, expensive cardstock with elegant script announcing my parents' 35th wedding anniversary celebration. The event was being held at their newest venue, a recently renovated space on the waterfront that had been featured in several design magazines. The invitation was formal and impersonal, the kind of thing you'd send to business associates rather than family. There was no handwritten note, no personal message, just my name printed in the same font as everyone else's. I held it for a long time, debating whether to attend. Part of me wanted to throw it away and forget about the whole thing. But another part of me, the part that still harbored some faint hope for reconciliation, couldn't quite let go. Maybe this would be different. Maybe in a setting focused on celebration rather than business, there'd be room for connection. Maybe I was fooling myself, but I decided to go anyway. I booked a flight from Portland, where I'd relocated to be closer to a cluster of clients, back to Seattle. The night before I left, I carefully wrapped a gift, a framed photograph of our family from years ago, back when things felt simpler. It was a gesture more symbolic than anything else, a way of acknowledging that I still wanted to be part of their lives, even if they'd made it clear I wasn't particularly welcome. Jason, my partner of 5 years, offered to come with me for support, but I told him this was something I needed to do alone. He drove me to the airport early that Saturday morning, kissed me goodbye, and told me to call if I needed him. I promised I would, though I had no intention of doing so unless absolutely necessary. This was my family, my mess to navigate. The flight was uneventful, but felt endless. I stared out the window at the clouds below, trying to quiet the anxious thoughts circling in my mind. What would I say when I saw them? Would they even acknowledge me? Would Delilah be civil? Or would she find some way to make her disdain clear without causing a scene? By the time we landed, my stomach was in knots. I collected my small suitcase from baggage claim and caught a rideshare to a hotel near the venue. I'd decided not to stay with my parents, a choice that felt both self-protective and sad. I checked in, changed into the dress I'd brought for the occasion, and stood in front of the mirror, practicing a neutral smile. I looked composed. I looked like someone who belonged at an elegant anniversary party. I didn't feel like that person at all. The venue was stunning, exactly the kind of place Morrison Premier Events was known for. Soft lighting, beautiful floral arrangements, and a waterfront view that made everything feel romantic and expensive. Guests were arriving in waves, dressed in cocktail attire and carrying gifts wrapped in glossy paper. I recognized some of them, business partners and longtime clients who'd been part of my parents' world for as long as I could remember. I approached the entrance with my gift in hand, forcing myself to take slow, steady breaths. And that's when I saw her. Delilah was standing just inside the doorway, greeting guests with the practiced charm she'd perfected over years of working in hospitality. She wore a dark green dress that complemented her hair, and her smile was worn and welcoming until her eyes landed on me. Then everything about her expression changed. She stepped forward, positioning herself directly in my path. The warmth vanished, replaced by something cold and unyielding. For a moment, we just looked at each other. I waited for her to say something cutting, something that would at least acknowledge my presence, even if it was hostile. Instead, she spoke with a calmness that was somehow worse than anger. She told me I wasn't family anymore. She said it simply, as if she were informing me of a schedule change or a canceled reservation. No emotion, no explanation, just a factual statement delivered with absolute certainty. I felt my breath catch, but I forced myself to stay composed. I looked past her, searching for my parents, hoping they'd intervene, or at least show some sign that this wasn't what they wanted. But they were there, standing just behind Delilah, watching the entire exchange with expressions that revealed nothing. My mother's face was carefully neutral. My father's gaze was steady and unblinking. Neither of them moved. Neither of them spoke. Their silence was louder than any words could have been. In that moment, I understood. This wasn't Delilah acting on her own. This was a unified decision. They had discussed this, planned this, and agreed that I would not be welcome at their celebration. Years of distance and dismissal had led to this final, definitive rejection, and they felt no need to explain or justify it. I was simply no longer part of the Morrison family. I could have argued. I could have demanded an explanation or made a scene that would have forced them to confront what they were doing. But standing there on that doorstep with dozens of guests filing past us, I realized there was no point. You can't force people to value you. You can't convince someone to love you if they've already decided you're disposable. So I took a step back. I adjusted my grip on the gift I'd brought, feeling its weight in my hands, and turned away. The walk back to the street felt surreal. I could hear music and laughter spilling out from the venue behind me. The sounds of the celebration I was no longer part of. My heels clicked against the pavement with a steady rhythm that somehow kept me grounded. I didn't cry. I didn't look back. I just kept walking until I reached the corner, where I stopped and let myself breathe. The rejection hurt, but beneath the hurt was something else. Clarity. For years, I'd tried to maintain a connection with people who didn't want me unless I served a purpose for them. I'd bent myself into uncomfortable shapes, trying to earn approval that was never going to come. And now, finally, they'd been honest about it. The door had been closed, but in a strange way, that closure was also a kind of freedom. I no longer had to wonder if things would get better, or if I'd eventually find my place in their world. The answer was no, and knowing that meant I could stop trying. I walked several blocks before I found a small coffee shop that was still open despite the late hour. It was one of those cozy places with mismatched furniture and local art on the walls. The kind of spot that felt worlds away from the polished elegance of the venue I'd just left. I ordered a tea I didn't really want and chose a table in the back corner, away from the handful of other customers scattered throughout the space. I set my bag down, pulled out my laptop, and stared at the screen as it powered on. My hands were trembling slightly, though whether from anger or adrenaline or something else entirely, I couldn't say. The files were still there, tucked away in a folder I'd labeled with an innocuous name that wouldn't draw attention if anyone happened to glance at my screen. I opened it and began scrolling through the documents I'd saved months ago. Payroll records showing systematic wage theft. Internal emails discussing strategies to minimize labor costs at the expense of employees. Grant applications that painted a picture of a struggling business, while the internal ledgers told a completely different story. As I reviewed everything, I wasn't searching for new information. I already knew what these files contained. What I was searching for was the resolve to do something with them. And sitting there in that quiet coffee shop, still wearing the dress I'd chosen for a celebration I'd been barred from attending, I found it. I thought about Monica Rivera, a woman I'd briefly worked alongside during my time at Morrison Premier Events. She'd been with the company for nearly 8 years, managing logistics for their largest events. She was meticulous and hardworking, the kind of person who arrived early and stayed late to make sure every detail was perfect. One afternoon, she'd stopped by my desk with a stack of payroll documents and a question in her eyes that she never quite voiced aloud. She'd pointed to a discrepancy in her hours, a gap between what she'd worked and what she'd been paid for, and asked if I knew why that might have happened. I'd told her I'd look into it, but before I could follow up, she'd been let go. The official reason was restructuring, but I suspected it had more to do with the fact that she'd started asking uncomfortable questions. I thought about all the other employees who'd been squeezed by Morrison Premier Events practices. People who'd worked through exhaustion during busy seasons, who'd been pressured to accept less than they'd earned, who'd stayed silent because they needed the job and couldn't afford to make waves. My parents had built their business on the backs of those people, and they'd done it while presenting themselves as pillars of the community. The hypocrisy of it made my stomach turn. I knew what I needed to do, but I also knew it would be irreversible. Once I took this step, there would be no going back. The bridge between me and my family would be burned completely. But honestly, standing on that doorstep earlier, watching them reject me without hesitation or regret, I realized the bridge had already been burned. They'd lit the match. I was just acknowledging the ashes. I opened a new browser tab and searched for investigative journalists in the Seattle area. Several names came up, but one stood out immediately. Naomi Fletcher. I'd read her work before, a detailed exposé on a local restaurant chain that had been exploiting immigrant workers. Her reporting had been thorough and unflinching, backed by solid evidence, and told with a clarity that made the injustice impossible to ignore. She didn't sensationalize. She didn't editorialize. She simply presented the facts and let them speak for themselves. That was exactly what I needed. I found her contact information through the news outlet she worked for and drafted an email. I kept it brief and factual. I explained who I was, what I'd discovered, and what I was prepared to share. I attached a selection of the most damning documents, enough to demonstrate that this wasn't a minor issue or a misunderstanding, but a pattern of illegal behavior that had been going on for years. My finger hovered over the send button for what felt like an eternity. This was the moment. Once I sent this email, everything would change. My family would know I was responsible. They'd be furious. They'd probably try to retaliate in whatever ways they could. But they'd also have to face the consequences of what they'd done. I pressed send. The email disappeared from my screen, and for a moment I just sat there, feeling the weight of what I'd just set in motion. There was no relief, no sense of triumph, just a quiet acceptance that I'd made a choice I couldn't unmake. My phone buzzed a few minutes later. It was a reply from Naomi, brief and professional. She thanked me for reaching out and asked if I'd be available for a call to discuss the documents in more detail. I stepped outside into the cool Seattle evening and dialed her number. Her voice was calm and measured, the kind of voice that inspired confidence without demanding it. She asked questions that were pointed but not invasive, seeking to understand the scope of what I'd uncovered and to verify that the documents were legitimate. I answered as honestly as I could, walking her through the timeline of my discovery and explaining the context behind each file. She listened without interrupting, occasionally asking for clarification, but mostly just absorbing the information I was providing. When I finished, there was a brief pause on the other end of the line. Then Naomi spoke, and I could hear the shift in her tone. She told me that what I'd shared was significant, that the evidence was compelling, and that she'd need some time to verify details and reach out to additional sources, but that she intended to move forward with the story. She also warned me, gently but firmly, that this would likely have serious repercussions for my family and for me personally. She asked if I was prepared for that. I told her I was. I wasn't sure if that was entirely true, but I knew I couldn't turn back now. We ended the call with her promising to keep me updated on her progress. I stood on the sidewalk for a while after that, watching cars pass and people walk by, all of them living their lives completely unaware of the small earthquake I'd just triggered. Eventually, I returned to my hotel, changed out of my dress, and lay in bed staring at the ceiling. Sleep didn't come easily, but when it finally did, it was deep and dreamless. The next morning arrived with a gray sky that matched my mood perfectly. I woke early, my mind already racing through everything that had happened the night before. I ordered room service, more out of necessity than appetite, and sat by the window watching the city wake up. My phone had several missed calls from my mother, all of them from late last night after I'd already fallen asleep. There were text messages too, each one progressively more insistent, asking where I was and why I'd left the venue. The irony wasn't lost on me. They'd made it clear I wasn't welcome, yet somehow my absence had become an inconvenience worth commenting on. I didn't respond. There was nothing left to say to them. At least, not yet. Instead, I checked my email and found another message from Naomi Fletcher. She'd worked through the night, cross-referencing the documents I'd provided with public records and reaching out to former Morrison Premier Events employees whose names had appeared in the payroll files. She'd already confirmed several key details and was planning to publish her initial findings within 48 hours. She wanted to give me advance notice and asked if I needed any support or had concerns about safety once the story went live. I appreciated her thoughtfulness, though the question about safety made the situation feel suddenly more real and more dangerous. I assured her I'd be fine and thanked her for the heads up. The rest of Sunday passed in a strange, suspended state. I stayed in my hotel room, alternating between reviewing work emails from my own clients and refreshing news sites to see if anything had been published yet. By evening, I'd made the decision to fly back to Portland the next morning, rather than stay in Seattle any longer. There was nothing keeping me here, and being in the same city as my family while waiting for the story to break felt unnecessarily masochistic. I rebooked my flight, packed my bag, and tried to settle my nerves with a long bath and a glass of wine from the hotel minibar. It helped marginally. That night, I actually managed to sleep, though my dreams were fractured and unsettling, filled with images of locked doors and voices I couldn't quite hear. Monday morning, I checked out of the hotel and headed to the airport. A flight home was mercifully short, and by early afternoon, I was walking through the door of my apartment in Portland. Jason was there, working from home as he often did. And the moment he saw my face, he knew something significant had happened. I told him everything. About being turned away at the door, about sending the files to Naomi Fletcher, about what was likely to unfold over the next few days. He listened without judgment, his expression shifting from concern to quiet pride as I explained my reasoning. When I finished, he pulled me into a hug and told me he supported whatever I'd decided to do. That simple statement meant more to me than he probably realized. For so long, I'd existed in a family where support was conditional, where approval had to be earned through compliance. Having someone stand beside me without asking me to justify my choices felt like oxygen after years of holding my breath. Tuesday arrived with the weight of anticipation pressing down on every hour. I tried to focus on work, returning client calls and reviewing financial statements, but my attention kept drifting to my phone. Finally, around 2 in the afternoon, Naomi sent me a link with a brief message. "It's live. Brace yourself." I clicked on the link and watched as the article loaded on my screen. The headline was direct and uncompromising. Morrison Premier Events accused of wage theft and misuse of federal relief funds. Below it was Naomi's byline and a publication timestamp showing it had gone live less than 30 minutes ago. I began reading, and with each paragraph, I felt a strange mixture of vindication and dread. Naomi had done exactly what I'd hoped she would. She'd presented the facts methodically, supported by the documents I'd provided and corroborated by interviews with former employees. The article detailed how Morrison Premier Events had systematically underpaid staff by pressuring them to clock out before completing their work, resulting in thousands of hours of unpaid labor over several years. It explained how federal relief grants intended to support struggling businesses during economic crises had been redirected toward personal expenses and luxury upgrades that had nothing to do with employee welfare or operational necessity. Naomi had even managed to track down Monica Rivera, who'd gone on record describing the pressure she'd faced to accept less than she'd earned and the retaliation she'd experienced when she'd questioned the discrepancies. The article included statements from 2 other former employees who corroborated Monica's account, creating a pattern that was impossible to dismiss as isolated incidents or misunderstandings. Near the end of the piece, Naomi had included a paragraph noting that the information had been provided by a source with direct access to Morrison Premier Events' internal financial records. She didn't name me, honoring the agreement we'd made to keep my identity confidential for now, but anyone within the family would immediately know who that source was. There was no one else it could have been. I sat back in my chair and exhaled slowly. It was done. The truth was out there now, published on a reputable news site, and already being shared across social media. Within minutes of my reading it, my phone started buzzing with notifications. Friends and former colleagues were sending me links to the article, some with messages of support, others simply with question marks, unsure if I'd seen it yet or what my connection to the story might be. Then the calls started. First my mother, then my father, then Delilah, all within the span of 10 minutes. I let each call go to voicemail. I wasn't ready to engage with them yet, wasn't ready to hear whatever accusations or justifications they were preparing. Instead, I silenced my phone and tried to refocus on the work in front of me, though the words on my screen might as well have been written in a foreign language for all the sense they made. My mind was elsewhere, imagining the scene unfolding at Morrison Premier Events' office. I pictured my father reading the article with mounting anger, my mother frantically calling their attorney, Delilah pacing the conference room, trying to formulate a response. I wondered if any of them felt shame or regret, or if their primary emotion was simply fury at being exposed. The media response was swift. By evening, the article had been picked up by several larger outlets. Local news stations were running segments on it, and business reporters were digging into Morrison Premier Events' history, looking for additional angles. The company's social media accounts, usually filled with glossy photos of beautiful venues and happy couples, were being flooded with comments from angry former employees and concerned clients. Some people were sharing their own experiences of being mistreated by the company. Others were simply expressing shock that a business with such a polished reputation could have been engaging in such practices. The Morrison name, which had once been synonymous with elegance and reliability, was now being associated with exploitation and fraud. I watched it all unfold from the safety of my apartment, feeling like I was observing something both inevitable and surreal. Wednesday brought new developments. The Washington State Department of Labor and Industries announced they were opening a formal investigation into Morrison Premier Events based on the allegations in Naomi's article. The statement was brief and professional, noting that they took such matters seriously and would be conducting a thorough review of the company's employment practices. Additionally, the federal agency responsible for overseeing the relief grant programs issued a statement confirming they were also looking into potential misuse of funds. These weren't just media stories anymore. These were official investigations with real legal consequences. My parents couldn't make this go away with carefully worded press releases or behind-the-scenes phone calls to influential friends. The machinery of accountability had been set in motion, and it would run its course, regardless of how much they wanted to stop it. That afternoon, Morrison Premier Events released a public statement. It was posted on their website and social media accounts, written in the kind of corporate language designed to sound reassuring while admitting nothing. They expressed disappointment at the allegations, described them as misleading and taken out of context, and pledged full cooperation with any official inquiries, while maintaining confidence that the investigations would ultimately clear their name. They positioned themselves as victims of a disgruntled former contractor, clearly referencing me without naming me directly, and suggested that the entire situation was motivated by personal grievances rather than legitimate concerns. His statement was so predictable, it was almost boring. Of course they'd deny everything. Of course they'd try to discredit the source. It was the standard playbook for powerful people caught doing something wrong. What they couldn't control, however, was the growing chorus of voices contradicting their narrative. More former employees began coming forward, emboldened by Monica Rivera's willingness to speak publicly. They shared their own stories of wage theft, of being pressured to work off the clock, of seeing colleagues punished or fired for questioning management decisions. A former venue manager named David Chen gave an interview describing how he'd been instructed to alter time cards to reduce labor costs, and how he'd eventually quit because he couldn't reconcile the company's public image with the reality of how they treated their staff. Each new voice added weight to the accusations, making it harder for Morrison Premier Events to maintain their position that this was all a misunderstanding blown out of proportion by one vindictive individual. By Thursday, the pressure had intensified to the point where clients began publicly distancing themselves from the company. 2 upcoming weddings were relocated to different venues, with the couples releasing statements saying they couldn't in good conscience support a business facing such serious allegations. A major corporate client announced they were suspending their contract pending the outcome of the investigations. Industry partners who'd worked with Morrison Premier Events for years were suddenly unavailable for comment or issuing carefully neutral statements that avoided defending the company. The social fabric that had supported my parents' business for decades was unraveling thread by thread, and there was nothing they could do to stop it. Their reputation, built so carefully over so many years, was collapsing in real time. I continued monitoring everything from Portland, maintaining my distance while watching the consequences unfold. Jason kept checking on me, making sure I was eating and sleeping and not drowning in the weight of what I'd set in motion. My own clients were understanding, giving me space when I needed it and offering support when I asked for it. Several of them had read the article and reached out to express admiration for what they called my courage, though I didn't feel particularly courageous. I felt necessary. There's a difference between wanting to do something brave and simply being unable to live with yourself if you don't do what's right. This had been the latter. I hadn't exposed Morrison Premier Events because I wanted to be a hero. I'd done it because staying silent had become impossible. Friday afternoon, exactly 1 week after I'd been turned away from their anniversary celebration, my parents and Delilah showed up at my apartment. I'd just finished a client call when the buzzer rang. I checked the video intercom and felt my stomach drop when I saw the 3 of them standing in the lobby of my building. For a moment, I considered not letting them up. But curiosity won out over self-preservation, and I buzzed them in. By the time they knocked on my door, I'd had just enough time to steel myself for whatever was coming. I opened the door and stepped aside, allowing them to enter without offering any warmth or welcome. They filed into my living room, and the contrast between their expensive clothing and my modest apartment felt almost symbolic. They looked out of place here, like characters from one story who'd accidentally wandered into another. No one sat down. We all just stood there in an awkward configuration, the tension so thick it was almost visible. My mother spoke first, her voice tight with barely controlled emotion. She said they needed to talk about what I'd done, about the damage I'd caused, about the possibility of fixing this before it destroyed everything they'd built. My father's expression was harder, less conciliatory. He looked at me the way you might look at a stranger who'd wronged you, with a mixture of anger and incomprehension. Delilah stood slightly behind them, her arms crossed and her face set in a mask of cold fury. I let them speak, listening as they cycled through various strategies. They tried appealing to family loyalty, suggesting that whatever grievances I had should have been handled privately rather than aired in the media. They tried minimizing the severity of what they'd done, framing the wage issues as administrative errors, and the grant situation as a complex matter being misrepresented by people who didn't understand business finance. They tried blame shifting, suggesting that I'd misinterpreted documents because I lacked experience with their industry's specific practices. And finally, they tried bargaining, hinting that if I issued a public statement retracting my claims, or at least expressing doubt about their accuracy, they might be willing to include me back in the family fold. It was fascinating in a horrible way, to watch them deploy every manipulation technique they'd probably used successfully for years. But none of it worked on me, not anymore. When they finally ran out of arguments and stood there waiting for my response, I felt a strange calm settle over me. I told them the truth, simply and directly. I explained that I hadn't acted out of spite or family drama, but because what they'd done was illegal and harmful to people who'd trusted them. I reminded them of the employees who'd been cheated out of wages they'd earned, of the public funds they'd diverted for personal use, of the systematic dishonesty that had propped up their business for years. I made it clear that I had no intention of retracting anything, because everything I'd shared with Naomi Fletcher was true and supported by documentation they themselves had created. And I told them that their offer to welcome me back into the family was meaningless, because I no longer wanted to be part of a family built on exploitation and lies. The words came out steadier than I'd expected, without anger or emotion, just plain statement of fact. My mother's face crumpled slightly, though whether from genuine hurt or strategic performance, I couldn't tell. My father's jaw clenched, and I could see him struggling to maintain composure. But it was Delilah who broke first. She stepped forward, her voice rising as she accused me of jealousy, of never being able to accept that I wasn't as important to the business as she was, of using this situation as revenge for years of perceived slights. She called me selfish and vindictive, suggested I'd always been looking for a way to hurt them, and predicted that I'd end up alone and miserable while they rebuilt everything I'd tried to destroy. Her words were meant to wound, and to some extent they did. But they also revealed something important. Even now, faced with overwhelming evidence of wrongdoing, her primary concern wasn't the people they'd harmed or the laws they'd broken. It was her own wounded pride and her fury at being challenged. I didn't engage with her accusations. There was no point. Instead, I walked to the door and opened it, a clear signal that this conversation was over. My father made one last attempt, his voice taking on a tone that might have been meant as fatherly concern, but came across as threat. He warned me that I was making a mistake, that the investigators would find nothing substantial, and that when this all blew over, I'd be the one left looking foolish and malicious. He suggested I should think very carefully about whether I wanted to be on the wrong side of this situation when the truth came out. I almost laughed at the absurdity of it. The truth was already out. That's why they were standing in my apartment, desperate and angry, trying to convince me to help them bury it again. They left without another word, filing past me and into the hallway with rigid postures and tight expressions. I closed the door behind them and stood there for a long moment, listening to their footsteps fade as they headed toward the elevator. Then I sat down on my couch and let out a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding. That encounter had been difficult, but it had also been clarifying. Any lingering doubt I'd had about whether I'd made the right choice evaporated completely. They weren't sorry for what they'd done. They were sorry they'd been caught. And they weren't here to make amends. They were here to protect themselves. The difference was everything. Over the following weeks, I watched from a distance as the investigations progressed. The Department of Labor conducted interviews with current and former employees, reviewed time cards and payroll records, and compared what Morrison Premier Events had reported to what had actually happened. The federal agency examining the relief grants brought in forensic accountants to trace how the money had moved through the company's accounts. Both investigations were thorough and methodical, the kind of processes that don't rush to conclusions but also don't let things slide. Naomi Fletcher continued reporting on developments, publishing follow-up articles as new information emerged. She'd become the go-to journalist for this story, and her coverage remained as balanced and fact-based as her initial piece had been. In early autumn, the first official findings were released. The Department of Labor concluded that Morrison Premier Events had violated wage and hour laws on a systematic basis over a period of at least 4 years. They'd failed to properly compensate employees for overtime, had pressured workers to perform duties off the clock, and had retaliated against employees who'd raised concerns about payment discrepancies. The financial penalties were substantial, running into hundreds of thousands of dollars in back wages, fines, and damages. But more significant than the money was the formal finding of willful violations, which carried implications for future oversight and potential criminal referrals. My parents couldn't dismiss this as a misunderstanding or a difference of interpretation. The state had investigated and concluded they'd broken the law deliberately and repeatedly. The federal findings came a few weeks later and were even more damning. Forensic accountants had traced the relief grant funds through Morrison Premier Events accounts and confirmed that significant amounts had been used for purposes unrelated to the stated goals of employee retention and operational stability. Luxury renovations, personal travel, executive bonuses, none of it qualified as appropriate use of public assistance funds. The report outlined a pattern of deception from the initial applications that overstated the company's financial distress to the internal documentation showing how the money had actually been spent. The consequences included demands for full repayment of the misused funds, plus penalties, a ban on applying for future federal assistance programs, and referral to law enforcement for potential criminal prosecution. From the initial applications that overstated the company's financial distress to the internal documentation showing how the money had actually been spent. The consequences included demands for full repayment of the misused funds, plus penalties, a ban on applying for future federal assistance programs, and referral to law enforcement for potential criminal prosecution. I want to take a moment to acknowledge your support. If these words resonate with you, please like this video and subscribe to the channel. Tell me which city you're from, so I can see how far a woman's impactful voice can truly reach. Together, we're building a community that values truth and accountability, and your presence here makes that possible. Thank you for listening to my story. The combined weight of these findings crushed Morrison Premier Events' remaining credibility. Insurance companies reviewed their policies and found grounds to deny coverage for some of the claims related to the investigations. Banks that had extended lines of credit began calling in loans or refusing to renew them. The company's bond rating was downgraded, making it more expensive and difficult to secure the insurance required to operate event venues. Vendors who'd worked with them for years started demanding payment up front rather than extending the net 30 or net 60 terms they'd previously offered. Business infrastructure that had seemed so solid began cracking from multiple directions at once, each crack weakening the overall structure until collapse became not just possible, but probable. My parents made several attempts to salvage the situation. They hired crisis management consultants who crafted carefully worded apologies that admitted to mistakes, while avoiding language that could be used against them in legal proceedings. They reached settlements with some former employees, buying silence and dropping potential lawsuits before they could generate more negative publicity. They restructured the company's leadership, with my father stepping back from day-to-day operations and bringing in an outside CEO who could claim to be cleaning house and implementing new ethical standards. But all of these efforts felt cosmetic, like rearranging furniture in a house with a crumbling foundation. The core problem wasn't bad publicity or poor management practices. The core problem was that they'd built a business on taking advantage of people. And now, those people were refusing to be silent anymore. Delilah's position became untenable fairly quickly. As the public face of Morrison Premier Events for the past several years, she'd been closely associated with the company's operations during the period when most of the violations occurred. While she tried to distance herself by claiming she hadn't been involved in financial decisions, her own emails and text messages, subpoenaed during the investigations, told a different story. She'd been aware of the payroll practices. She'd participated in discussions about how to categorize grant expenditures. She'd even directly instructed managers to have employees clock out before finishing event breakdowns. The paper trail was damning, and her attempts to plead ignorance or shift blame onto others only made her look worse. By late autumn, Delilah announced she was stepping down from her role at Morrison Premier Events to pursue other opportunities. The statement was vague and corporate, but the reality was clear to anyone paying attention. She'd been pushed out, either by the board of directors trying to salvage what they could of the company's reputation, or by my parents trying to create a firewall between the family name and the worst of the scandal. Either way, her departure felt like a particularly appropriate form of poetic justice. She'd spent years defining herself through her position in the company, had lorded that position over me countless times, and now it was gone, stripped away by consequences she'd helped create. I didn't take pleasure in her downfall, but I didn't mourn it either. She'd made her choices, and now she was living with them. My parents fared somewhat better publicly, but worse privately. They managed to hold on to nominal leadership of the company, though in a drastically reduced capacity. Morrison Premier Events was forced to sell off several of its venues to cover legal fees, settlements, and penalties. The flagship location in Bellevue, the one they'd been so proud of, went on the market and sold quickly to a competitor who rebranded it immediately. Their workforce shrank from over 100 employees to fewer than 30. The company that had once dominated the upscale events market in Washington state became a shadow of its former self, operating on a much smaller scale with a fraction of its previous influence and revenue. For two people who'd built their entire identities around business success and community standing, the reduction had to be devastating. Their social circle contracted as well. Friends who'd been happy to attend their parties and celebrate their successes suddenly became scarce when they needed support. Invitations to charity boards and community organizations dried up. The local magazine that had once featured them as examples of entrepreneurial success ran a follow-up article examining how they'd fallen from grace. It was brutal in its thoroughness. Interviewing former associates who now felt comfortable sharing their own concerns about the Morrisons' business practices, concerns they'd kept quiet about when the family had power and influence. My parents' carefully constructed image as pillars of the community dissolved almost overnight, replaced by a reputation as people who'd exploited their workers and defrauded the government. That stain doesn't wash off easily, if it ever does at all. Throughout all of this, I maintained my distance. I didn't reach out to them, and they didn't contact me again after that confrontation in my apartment. We existed in separate worlds now, connected only by biology and a shared last name I'd been considering changing. My own life, meanwhile, continued to move forward. My accounting practice grew steadily as word spread about my commitment to ethical practices and transparent bookkeeping. Several of my former colleagues from Morrison Premier Events reached out to ask if I was taking on new clients, wanting to work with someone they trusted after everything that had happened. I hired an associate to help manage the increased workload and started thinking about potentially expanding into a small firm rather than remaining a solo practitioner. Jason and I got engaged that winter, a quiet decision made over dinner at our favorite restaurant with no drama or grand gestures, just a mutual recognition that we wanted to build a life together. Planning the wedding was surprisingly fun, made easier by the fact that I had a very short list of family members to consider inviting. In the end, I decided against inviting my parents or Delilah. Some people might have seen that as vindictive, but for me, it was simply honest. I wanted to be surrounded by people who actually cared about me and supported the life I was building. My family didn't qualify. Instead, the guest list was filled with friends, colleagues, and Jason's warm, welcoming family who'd embraced me without reservation. Spring arrived with the kind of soft beauty that makes you believe in new beginnings. The legal proceedings against Morrison Premier Events were ongoing, likely to continue for another year or more, as various parties negotiated settlements and potential criminal charges worked their way through the system. I'd been interviewed several times by investigators and had provided testimony that I understood would be part of the case against the company. Each time, I answered questions truthfully and completely, never hiding behind vague language or convenient memory lapses. It wasn't pleasant to be part of something that would ultimately destroy what my family had built, but it was necessary. Justice doesn't happen by accident. It requires people to step forward and tell the truth, even when it's uncomfortable. One afternoon in April, about 7 months after everything had begun, I received an unexpected phone call. The number wasn't saved in my contacts, but the area code was Seattle. I almost didn't answer, assuming it was another journalist or investigator reaching out for comment. But something made me pick up. The voice on the other end was tentative and cautious. It was Monica Rivera, the former logistics manager whose testimony had been so crucial in establishing the pattern of wage theft at Morrison Premiered Events. We'd never spoken directly, though I'd followed her story through Naomi Fletcher's articles and the investigation reports. She explained that she'd gotten my number through a mutual contact and hoped I didn't mind her reaching out. I assured her I didn't mind at all. Monica told me she was calling to thank me. She said that coming forward had been the hardest thing she'd ever done professionally, that she'd been terrified of retaliation and worried about being blacklisted in the events industry. But seeing my willingness to expose the truth, despite my family connections, had given her courage to tell her own story. She wanted me to know that the back wages she'd received as part of the settlement had made a real difference in her life, allowing her to catch up on bills and even start saving for her daughter's college fund. Her voice cracked slightly as she spoke, and I felt my own throat tighten with emotion. This was why it had mattered. Not the headlines or the satisfaction of watching my family face consequences, but the tangible impact on real people who'd been hurt by their practices. We talked for almost an hour. Monica shared details about what it had been like working for Morrison Premiere Events, the slow erosion of boundaries between reasonable demands and exploitation, the way management had made employees feel guilty for expecting fair compensation. She described the relief she'd felt when the investigation began, the validation of having her experiences taken seriously after years of being told she was being difficult or ungrateful. She'd since found a new position with a company that treated her with respect and paid her properly, and she was rebuilding her career with a sense of security she hadn't felt in years. Hearing her story reinforced everything I'd believed about the importance of speaking up. Silence protects the powerful and abandons the vulnerable. Truth-telling, even when it costs you personally, creates space for justice. After we hung up, I sat quietly for a while, processing the conversation. Over the following weeks, I heard from several other former Morrison Premiere Events employees. Some reached out through social media, others through email, and a few through mutual connections. Each person had their own story, their own experience of being undervalued and taken advantage of, their own journey towards speaking up and demanding accountability. Many of them thanked me, though I didn't feel I deserved thanks for simply doing what was right. What struck me most was the pattern that emerged from all these conversations. My family hadn't just harmed a few individuals through isolated incidents. They'd created a culture where exploitation was normalized, where people were made to feel they should be grateful for jobs that didn't even pay them what they'd earned. The wedding took place in early June at a small vineyard in the Willamette Valley, about an hour outside Portland. It was intimate and beautiful, with fewer than 50 guests and an atmosphere that felt genuinely joyful rather than performative. Jason's parents welcomed me with tears and hugs, telling me they were honored to have me joining their family. His sister gave a toast about finding people who bring out the best in us and choosing to surround ourselves with authenticity rather than obligation. I thought about how different this felt from every Morrison family event I'd ever attended, where appearances mattered more than substance and love was conditional on compliance. This was what family was supposed to feel like: safe, supportive, accepting. During the reception, I found a quiet moment to step outside and look at the sunset painting the vineyard hills in shades of amber and rose. Naomi Fletcher had attended as my guest, and she joined me on the terrace with 2 glasses of champagne. We stood there in comfortable silence for a moment before she spoke. She told me she'd been covering stories of corporate wrongdoing and exploitation for nearly 15 years, and that what had impressed her most about my situation wasn't just the evidence I'd provided, but the clarity of purpose I'd maintained throughout. She said most people who expose corruption do so with mixed motives, wrestling with guilt and second-guessing themselves constantly. But from our very first conversation, I'd seemed certain about what needed to be done and why. She asked me how I'd found that certainty. I thought about her question carefully before answering. I explained that it hadn't been certainty so much as necessity. Once I'd seen the evidence of what my family was doing, once I'd understood the real impact on real people, staying silent would have required me to become complicit, and I couldn't live with that version of myself. Choosing my family's comfort over other people's welfare would have meant betraying my own values, and at that point, the relationship with my family was already so damaged that protecting it seemed pointless. I hadn't exposed Morrison Premier events because I was brave or righteous. I'd done it because the alternative was becoming someone I couldn't respect. Naomi nodded thoughtfully, then raised her glass in a quiet toast to integrity. We clinked glasses and returned to the celebration, where Jason was looking for me with a smile that made everything else fade into background noise. Summer passed in a blur of settling into married life and growing my business. The Morrison Premier event story had largely moved out of the daily news cycle, though it continued to permeate industry conversations and professional circles. I heard through various channels that my parents had essentially retired, stepping back from public life and letting the remnants of their company operate under new management. Delilah had moved to California, taking a mid-level position at a corporate events firm where her last name didn't carry the same weight or stigma. The physical distance between us now matched the emotional distance that had always existed. I wondered occasionally if any of them had gained perspective, if they'd used this catastrophic failure as an opportunity for growth and self-reflection, but I doubted it. People who build their identities on power and status rarely transform in meaningful ways when those things are taken away. They just become bitter and defensive, convinced they've been wronged, rather than recognizing they've faced consequences. In September, nearly a year after the initial article had been published, the criminal case against Morrison Premier Events reached a resolution. My father, as the company's founder and CEO during the period when the grant fraud occurred, was charged with multiple counts of misuse of federal funds and making false statements. After months of negotiations, he accepted a plea deal that included probation, community service, significant fines, and permanent prohibition from holding leadership positions in any company receiving federal contracts or assistance. He avoided jail time, which his attorneys framed as a victory, but the conviction meant he was now a felon. That label would follow him for the rest of his life, shaping how he was seen and limiting what opportunities remained available to him. My mother, who'd been less directly involved in the financial decisions but had certainly benefited from them, wasn't criminally charged, but faced civil penalties as a partial owner of the company. Delilah was also named in civil suits brought by employees seeking damages beyond what the initial settlements had provided. The legal entanglements would likely continue for years, a long tail of consequences that would keep the wounds from fully healing. I followed these developments with a strange detachment, as if I were reading about strangers rather than people I'd once called family. The emotional connection had been severed so completely that even their suffering didn't move me the way it might have once. I didn't take pleasure in it, but I didn't feel guilt either. They'd created this situation through their own choices, and they were simply living with the results. That autumn, I was approached by a local business ethics organization that wanted me to speak at their annual conference. They'd been following the Morrison Premier Events case and thought my perspective as a whistleblower would be valuable for their audience of accountants, auditors, and financial professionals. I was hesitant at first, uncomfortable with the idea of being held up as some kind of moral exemplar when I'd simply done what seemed necessary. But Jason encouraged me to consider it, pointing out that my experience could genuinely help other people facing similar situations, people who might be struggling with whether to speak up about wrongdoing they'd witnessed. After thinking it over for a few days, I agreed. The conference was held at a hotel in downtown Portland in late October. I prepared remarks focusing on the practical aspects of recognizing financial fraud, the importance of documentation, and the resources available to people who need to report corporate misconduct. But when I stood at the podium, looking out at a room full of professionals, I found myself speaking more personally than I'd planned. I talked about the cost of staying silent, not just in terms of enabling harm to others, but in terms of what it does to your own integrity and sense of self. I described the isolation of knowing something is wrong, but feeling powerless to address it. I acknowledged the real risks of whistleblowing, the professional and personal consequences that can follow. But I also emphasized that sometimes the cost of speaking up is less than the cost of remaining silent, especially when you calculate that cost in terms of who you want to be as a person. The response was overwhelming. During the question and answer session, several people shared their own experiences of witnessing misconduct and feeling torn about how to respond. One woman described working for a nonprofit where donation money was being diverted to personal use by leadership, and her struggle with whether reporting it would destroy an organization that also did genuine good. A young man talked about discovering that his employer was systematically overcharging vulnerable clients, and his fear that speaking up would end his career before it really began. I didn't have perfect answers for any of them, but I tried to offer the perspective I'd gained through my own experience. Sometimes doing the right thing means accepting losses you shouldn't have to bear. Sometimes justice is expensive and complicated, and doesn't feel satisfying even when it prevails. But staying silent to protect your own comfort while others are being harmed is a choice with its own consequences, ones that compound over time. After my presentation, a line of people waited to speak with me individually. Many just wanted to shake my hand and thank me for sharing my story. Others had specific questions about mechanics and procedures, wanting to know how to document concerns properly or which agencies to contact for different types of violations. A few shared their own stories in hushed, urgent tones, sometimes crying as they described situations they'd been carrying alone for months or years. I listened to each person, offered what guidance I could, and encouraged them to trust their own moral compass even when the path forward wasn't clear. By the time the last person left, I was emotionally exhausted but also strangely energized. This was meaningful work, helping people navigate these impossible situations and reminding them that speaking truth, even difficult truth, matters profoundly. Winter arrived with the kind of gray, persistent rain that Portland is famous for. Jason and I spent evenings curled up on the couch, planning for the future and processing everything that had happened over the past year. We talked about buying a house, maybe starting a family in the next few years, building the kind of life that felt stable and authentic. We also talked about my relationship with my family, or rather, the absence of one. Jason asked occasionally if I ever considered reaching out, if there was any part of me that wanted reconciliation. I appreciated that he asked without judgment, simply trying to understand where I stood emotionally. The truth was complicated. There were moments, usually late at night or during holidays, when I felt a pang of loss for what might have been if things had been different. But I didn't miss the people my family actually were. I missed an idealized version of them that had never really existed. In December, almost exactly a year after I'd been turned away from the anniversary celebration that had catalyzed everything, I received a letter in the mail. The return address was my parents' house in Seattle, and the envelope was addressed in my mother's careful handwriting. I stared at it for a long time before opening it, unsure what I'd find inside. When I finally did, I discovered a handwritten note, just a few paragraphs on expensive stationery. My mother's words were measured and formal, lacking the emotional intimacy you'd expect in a letter from a parent to a child. She acknowledged that the past year had been difficult for everyone involved. She stated that she and my father had had considerable time to reflect on their choices and the consequences those choices had brought. She didn't explicitly apologize for turning me away from the anniversary party, but she expressed regret that our relationship had deteriorated to the point where I'd felt the need to take such drastic action. The letter suggested that perhaps with time and effort, we might find a way to rebuild some form of connection. She proposed meeting for coffee if I was ever in Seattle, just to talk without the pressure of resolving everything at once. The tone was cautious and somewhat stiff, but there was an underlying thread of something that might have been genuine remorse, or at least a recognition that things had gone wrong. I read the letter several times, analyzing every word choice and trying to determine what my mother was really saying beneath the careful language. Was this a sincere attempt at reconciliation? Or was it strategic image management, an effort to be able to say they'd tried to repair the relationship I'd damaged? I honestly couldn't tell, and that uncertainty told me everything I needed to know about where we really stood. I didn't respond immediately. Instead, I let the letter sit on my desk for several weeks while I considered what, if anything, I wanted to say. Jason's opinion was that I should do whatever felt right for me, with no obligation to maintain a relationship that had been toxic simply because we shared DNA. My therapist, whom I'd started seeing regularly after everything had exploded, encouraged me to think about what I needed from my family in order to consider reconnecting, and whether they were capable of providing those things. After careful reflection, I realized that what I needed was something they'd never offered: genuine acknowledgement of the harm they'd caused, not just to me, but to the employees they'd exploited. I needed to hear that they understood why their actions had been wrong, not just regret that they'd been caught. I needed evidence that they'd changed in fundamental ways, not just surface-level damage control. In mid-January, I finally sat down and wrote a response. I kept it brief and honest. I thanked my mother for reaching out and acknowledged that I appreciated the gesture, but I explained that I wasn't ready to meet or to attempt rebuilding a relationship until I saw clear evidence that they genuinely grappled with the ethics of what they'd done and made meaningful amends to the people they'd harmed. I noted that they still had outstanding civil cases and unpaid settlements, that their public statements had consistently minimized their responsibility, and that as far as I knew, they'd never directly apologized to the employees who'd been cheated. I told her that if those things changed, if they demonstrated real accountability rather than just strategic contrition, I'd be open to reconsidering. But until then, maintaining distance was the healthiest choice for me. I signed it simply with my first name, no endearments or expressions of love. It felt appropriate for where we actually were, rather than where I might wish we could be. I never received a response to that letter. The silence told me what I'd suspected. They'd been hoping for reconciliation on their terms, for me to be the one to bend and accommodate, to prioritize relationship over principle. When I made it clear that reconciliation would require them to do the hard work of genuine change and accountability, they'd apparently decided it wasn't worth the effort. That hurt in a dull, distant way, like an old injury that aches when the weather changes. But it also clarified things. I could stop wondering and hoping. I could accept the reality that this was who they were and how they'd chosen to be. And I could move forward with my own life without that uncertainty hanging over me. Spring returned, bringing with it a sense of renewal and possibility. My accounting practice had grown to the point where I needed to hire a second associate, and we moved into a larger office space with actual conference rooms and proper filing systems. I was developing a reputation as someone who specialized in helping small businesses navigate complex financial situations ethically, and my client base reflected that focus. I worked with nonprofits, ensuring their donation tracking was impeccable, with startups setting up bookkeeping systems designed for transparency, with family businesses transitioning between generations and wanting to avoid the kinds of pitfalls that had destroyed my own family's company. The work was intellectually challenging and emotionally satisfying in ways I'd never experienced while trying to find my place in the Morrison family structure. Jason and I bought our first house that May, a modest, craftsman-style home in a quiet neighborhood with good schools. Even though we didn't have kids yet, we spent weekends painting walls and planting a garden, building something that was entirely ours. His family came to visit often, and I found myself experiencing what healthy family dynamics actually looked like. His parents asked about my work because they were genuinely interested, not because they were calculating how it could benefit them. His sister invited us to family dinners where the conversation flowed naturally, without undercurrents of competition or judgment. It was strange and wonderful to be part of a family system where people actually seemed to like each other and want to spend time together. I'd thought that kind of thing only existed in movies. That summer, Naomi Fletcher reached out to tell me she was working on a longer-form piece about corporate whistleblowers and their experiences navigating the aftermath of coming forward. She wanted to include my story as one of several case studies. We met for lunch, and I agreed to participate, though I asked her to focus less on my family dynamics and more on the systemic issues that make whistleblowing so difficult and necessary. She understood what I was asking for, and when the article was published a few months later, it was thoughtful and nuanced. It examined the personal costs of speaking up, the inadequate protections for people who report wrongdoing, and the cultural changes needed to make accountability less dependent on individual acts of courage. The piece generated another wave of speaking invitations. I started getting requests from universities wanting me to talk to business ethics classes, from professional organizations hosting continuing education seminars, from companies trying to create better internal reporting mechanisms. I accepted the ones that felt meaningful and declined the ones that seemed more interested in spectacle than substance. Gradually, I developed a second professional identity alongside my accounting practice. I became someone known for thinking carefully about integrity in business, about the intersection of personal values and professional obligations, about creating systems that make it easier to do the right thing. It wasn't something I'd planned or pursued, but it felt like a natural extension of everything I'd been through. In the fall, almost 2 years after the initial exposure of Morrison Premier Events' wrongdoing, I received an unexpected email from Delilah. It was short and somewhat awkward, written in a tone that suggested she'd drafted it multiple times before finally hitting send. She said she'd been following my speaking engagements and had read Naomi's article. She acknowledged briefly, and without much detail, that she'd been wrong about many things, and had spent the past 2 years working with a therapist to understand her own role in what had happened. She didn't ask for forgiveness or reconciliation. She simply said she wanted me to know that she recognized I'd done the right thing, even though it had cost our family dearly, and that she respected the life I'd built for myself. The email ended with a sentence that surprised me. "You were always braver than I gave you credit for, and I'm sorry it took me this long to see it." I read that email several times, searching for hidden agendas or manipulative undertones. But it seemed genuine, or at least as genuine as anything between us could be at this point. I wrote back a brief response, thanking her for reaching out and acknowledging that I appreciated her words. I didn't suggest meeting or offer to rebuild our sisterly relationship. Too much had happened and too much time had passed. but I also didn't close the door entirely. I told her I hoped she was finding peace in California and that I wished her well in whatever path she was pursuing. It felt like the right balance between acknowledging her gesture and maintaining appropriate boundaries. Whether anything would grow from that small exchange remained to be seen, but I wasn't going to force it or rush it. Some bridges, once burned, take a very long time to rebuild, if they can be rebuilt at all. My parents never reached out again. Occasionally I'd hear news about them through mutual acquaintances or see their names mentioned in articles about business ethics failures. They'd become cautionary tales, examples of how success built on exploitation eventually collapses under its own weight. From what I understood, they'd sold their house in Seattle and moved to a smaller place outside the city, living quietly on whatever remained of their savings after legal fees, settlements, and penalties. The social circles that had once defined their existence had moved on without them. They were no longer invited to the galas and fundraisers they'd once attended as honored guests. Their legacy, which they'd worked so hard to build and polish, was permanently tarnished. I didn't take satisfaction in their reduced circumstances, but I didn't feel guilty about them either. They'd had choices at every step, and they'd consistently chosen profit over principle, image over integrity. As the second anniversary of the initial exposure approached, I found myself reflecting on how profoundly my life had changed. I'd lost my family of origin, but gained clarity about who I was and what I stood for. I'd experienced the costs of standing up for what's right, but also the rewards of being able to look at myself in the mirror without shame. I'd learned that loyalty without respect is worthless, that protecting wrongdoers makes you complicit in their wrongdoing, and that sometimes the most loving thing you can do is set boundaries that force people to confront consequences. These weren't easy lessons, and they'd come at a high price, but they were true lessons, ones that had shaped me into someone I could actually respect. Jason and I were sitting on our back porch one evening in December, wrapped in blankets and watching the first snow of the season begin to fall. He asked me if I ever regretted it, if there were moments when I wished I'd handled things differently or stayed silent to preserve family relationships. I thought about the question seriously before answering. I told him that there were moments when I grieved what I'd lost, or more accurately, what I'd never really had. There were times when I envied people with warm, functional families who gathered for holidays and genuinely enjoyed each other's company. But regret? No. I didn't regret exposing the truth. I couldn't regret making a choice that protected vulnerable people from continued exploitation. Even if that choice cost me personally, integrity isn't negotiable. Either you have it or you don't. And once you compromise it, everything else becomes easier to compromise too. He squeezed my hand and we sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching snowflakes accumulate on the bare branches of the trees in our yard. Eventually, he asked another question. What would I want people to take away from my story if they heard it? I considered that carefully. I told him I'd want people to understand that doing the right thing doesn't always feel triumphant or heroic. Sometimes it just feels necessary and sad and complicated. I'd want them to know that choosing integrity over convenience might cost you relationships and comfort and approval, but maintaining your self-respect is worth those losses. I'd want them to recognize that silence protects systems of power, while speaking up creates space for change, even when that change is painful. And maybe most importantly, I'd want them to understand that being excluded from a toxic system isn't the tragedy. The tragedy is contorting yourself to remain part of something that fundamentally contradicts your values. If you've listened to this entire story, I'm grateful for your time and attention. I hope something in my experience resonates with you or helps you think differently about a situation you're facing. If my words have impacted you, please show your support by liking this video and subscribing to the channel. Tell me which city you're from so I can see how far a woman's impactful voice can reach. Together, we're building a community that values truth over comfort and integrity over approval. and your presence here makes that community stronger. Thank you for being part of this journey with me. As winter settled in and another year drew to a close, I found myself thinking about the future with genuine optimism for the first time in years. Jason and I were talking seriously about starting a family, about raising children who'd grow up understanding that love shouldn't be conditional, and that doing the right thing matters more than maintaining appearances. I was excited to expand my business, to mentor young accountants and help them develop both technical skills and ethical frameworks. I'd been approached about co-authoring a book on corporate accountability with an investigative journalist, and while the project intimidated me, it also felt important. Emmy's value in telling these stories, in documenting not just the wrongdoing, but the process of exposure and consequence and rebuilding. In early January, I received an unexpected phone call from Monica Rivera. She'd been offered a position as the operations director for a nonprofit focused on workers' rights and fair labor practices. The organization wanted to hire someone who understood both the practical aspects of running large events and the importance of ethical employment practices. Monica was thrilled about the opportunity, but also nervous, worried that her association with the Morrison Premier Events scandal would make her a liability for the organization. She was calling to ask if I'd be willing to serve as a professional reference, to speak to her integrity and her courage in coming forward, even when it put her career at risk. I agreed immediately, honored that she'd thought to ask me, and excited for the opportunity this represented for her. A week later, I received a call from the nonprofit's executive director, a woman named Dr. Sarah Chen, who had built the organization from a small advocacy group into a respected voice for labor rights in the Pacific Northwest. She asked thoughtful questions about Monica's capabilities and character, and then surprised me by asking about my own experience with the Morrison Premier Events situation. We ended up talking for over an hour, discussing not just Monica's qualifications, but the broader issues of corporate accountability and the challenges of creating systems that protect workers from exploitation. By the end of the conversation, Dr. Chen had not only confirmed she was offering Monica the position, but had also asked if I'd be interested in joining their board of directors. I told her I needed to think about it, that I'd need to make sure I had the bandwidth to contribute meaningfully given my own professional commitments. But truthfully, I was already leaning toward yes. This felt like a natural evolution of everything I'd been through, a way to channel my experience into creating systemic change rather than just reacting to individual cases of wrongdoing. I discussed it with Jason that evening, and he encouraged me to accept, pointing out that this was exactly the kind of work I'd been gravitating toward anyway. A week later, I called Dr. Chen and told her I'd be honored to serve on the board. It felt like pieces falling into place, like the painful experiences of the past few years were transforming into something productive and meaningful. Spring arrived again, my third since walking away from my family's anniversary celebration. The anniversary of that night no longer carried the same emotional weight it once had. It had become simply a marker, a reference point for measuring how far I'd traveled. I was 44 now, settled in my marriage and my career, connected to a community of people who valued authenticity and accountability. My life bore no resemblance to what I'd imagined it would look like when I was younger, trying desperately to earn approval from people who'd never really seen me. But it was a life I'd built consciously, making difficult choices and accepting hard consequences. And that made it deeply satisfying in ways that easy approval never could have been. In April, I attended my first board meeting for the workers' rights nonprofit. The conference room was filled with people who dedicated their careers to protecting vulnerable workers, to challenging exploitative practices, to creating accountability for corporations that treated employees as disposable. As we discussed strategic priorities and reviewed cases the organization was supporting, I realized I'd found something I hadn't even known I was looking for, a sense of purpose that extended beyond my own story. Yes, I'd exposed wrongdoing in my family's business, but that was just one company. one set of violations. Here was an opportunity to contribute to larger patterns of change, to help build systems that made it harder for exploitation to flourish and easier for workers to seek justice when they were wronged. Monica was thriving in her new role. We met for lunch occasionally, and she'd update me on the projects she was leading and the impact the organization was having. She told me that being part of work that protected people from experiencing what she'd experienced at Morrison Premier events felt redemptive in a way she hadn't anticipated. She'd transformed her painful history into expertise and advocacy, and watching her do that inspired me to think about how I might do something similar. The accountant who'd uncovered fraud in her family's business could become someone who helped create better financial accountability systems across industries. The daughter who'd been rejected for telling the truth could become someone who made truth-telling less costly for others. That summer, Jason and I learned I was pregnant. The news brought joy, mixed with a strange awareness of how completely my life had diverged from my family of origin. My child would grow up without knowing their maternal grandparents, without cousins on my side, without the extended family network that many children take for granted. But they'd grow up in a home where honesty was valued more than image, where doing the right thing mattered more than avoiding conflict, where love was freely given rather than earned through compliance. They'd be surrounded by Jason's warm, accepting family and by the community of friends and colleagues I've built over the years. Maybe that was actually better than growing up embedded in a family system built on exploitation and maintained through silence. As my pregnancy progressed, I found myself thinking about the values I wanted to pass on to my child. Not just abstract principles, but practical wisdom about navigating a world where right and wrong aren't always clearly defined. I wanted them to understand that integrity sometimes requires sacrifice, that standing up for vulnerable people matters even when it's uncomfortable, that your worth isn't determined by other people's approval or disapproval. I wanted them to know that family is about how people treat each other, not just biology, and that it's okay to distance yourself from relationships that are harmful, even if society says you should preserve them. These were lessons I'd learned the hard way, and I hoped I could share them in ways that prepared my child for complexity without burdening them with my specific pain. In the autumn, as I entered my third trimester, the nonprofit asked me to speak at their annual fundraising gala. The event would draw donors, community leaders, and media attention, and they wanted someone who could speak personally about why this work mattered. I was enormously pregnant by that point, uncomfortable and tired, and public speaking while managing pregnancy brain felt daunting. But I agreed because the cause was important, and because I'd learned that showing up even when it's inconvenient is how meaningful work gets done. The night of the gala, I stood at the podium in a formal maternity dress, looking out at a room full of people who'd chosen to spend their evening supporting workers' rights. I told a condensed version of my story, focusing less on family drama and more on the structural issues that allowed Morrison Premier events to exploit employees for years before being held accountable. I talked about the importance of creating reporting mechanisms that protect whistleblowers, of enforcing labor laws consistently rather than selectively, of building a culture where companies compete on ethics and quality rather than on who can cut corners most effectively. I spoke about the employees who'd been harmed by my family's practices and the courage it had taken for them to come forward. And I emphasized that preventing exploitation required not just individual integrity, but systemic change, which was exactly what organizations like this one were working to create. The response was enthusiastic, and the event ultimately exceeded its fundraising goals, which felt like validation that the message had resonated. December arrived, and with it, the due date for my baby. Jason and I had decided not to find out the sex, wanting to be surprised. We'd prepared a nursery in soft yellows and greens, with a bookshelf already filled with children's books and a rocking chair positioned near the window where I could feed the baby while looking out at our small backyard. Everything felt ready, except me. I was nervous about becoming a mother, about being responsible for shaping another human's values and worldview. What if I damaged them the way my parents had damaged me? What if I couldn't break the cycles I'd inherited? Jason reassured me constantly, pointing out that my self-awareness and commitment to doing better already put me miles ahead of where my parents had been. But the fear lingered. Our daughter was born on December 15th, 3 years and 1 week after I'd been turned away from my family's anniversary celebration. We named her Maya, which means illusion or magic in Sanskrit, because her arrival felt like both. The illusion was that any of my fears about motherhood mattered once I held her. The magic was the immediate, overwhelming love I felt for this tiny person who'd been part of me and was now separate, dependent and vulnerable, and entirely herself. Looking at her perfect small face, I made a silent promise that she'd grow up knowing she was valued for who she was, not what she could do for anyone else. She'd be allowed to find her own path, make her own choices, build her own life. And if she ever needed to walk away from something toxic, even if that something included me, I'd support her in doing what was right for her. The early months of parenthood were exhausting and wonderful in equal measure. Jason was a natural father, patient and engaged, and genuinely excited about every milestone. His parents visited often, doting on their new granddaughter and helping with practical things like laundry and meals. I watched them interact with Maya and with us, noting how different it was from how my own parents had been with Delilah and me. There was unconditional delight in Maya's existence, no assessment of her usefulness or potential, just love. Simple, uncomplicated, freely given love. It made me grieve what I'd never had, while also feeling grateful that Maya would have it. When Maya was about 4 months old, I received one more letter from my mother. This one was different from the previous one, less formal and more personal. She wrote that she'd seen the announcement of Maya's birth, which someone had apparently shared with her. She said becoming a grandmother, even from a distance, had made her reflect on her own parenting and the mistakes she'd made. She acknowledged, more directly than she ever had before, that she'd valued success and image over her children's well-being, and that she'd enabled my father's worst impulses rather than challenging them. She expressed regret for turning me away from the anniversary party, and for the years of making me feel invisible unless I was useful. She didn't ask to meet Maya or to be part of her life. She simply said she wanted me to know that she understood, finally, what she'd lost through her own choices. I read that letter while nursing Maya, tears slipping down my face. It was the acknowledgement I'd needed years ago, the recognition that what had happened hadn't been my fault or my failure. But it had come too late to change the fundamental reality of our relationship. Too much had been broken for too long. I wrote back, thanking her for her honesty and telling her I appreciated her willingness to reflect and acknowledge her mistakes. I told her I forgave her, not because I wanted to rebuild our relationship, but because holding on to anger would only hurt me. I also told her I wasn't ready to have her in Maya's life, that protecting my daughter from potentially toxic dynamics was my priority. Maybe someday that would change, but for now, distance remained the healthiest choice. As Maya's first birthday approached, I found myself marveling at how much life had shifted in 4 years. 4 years ago, I'd been desperately trying to earn my family's approval, accepting crumbs of recognition and calling it love. Now I had a life so full of genuine connection and purpose that those old wounds had faded to scars, present but no longer painful. I had a partner who treated me as an equal and a teammate. I had a daughter who'd grow up in a home built on honesty and respect. I had work that challenged me intellectually, while aligning with my values. I had friends and colleagues who saw me clearly and valued what they saw. The life I'd built from the ashes of family rejection was richer and more authentic than anything I could have created while still seeking their approval. The workers' rights organization continued to grow and expand its impact, We'd successfully advocated for stronger labor enforcement in several sectors, supported dozens of workers in bringing complaints against exploitative employers, and created educational resources that helped people understand their rights and how to exercise them. Being part of that work gave me a sense of contributing to something larger than my own story, of turning personal pain into collective progress. Monica had become a dear friend, someone who understood the complexity of whistleblowing and rebuilding in ways most people couldn't. We'd occasionally joke that we were members of a club nobody wanted to join, but once you were in it, you found a kind of solidarity that was hard to describe to outsiders. My accounting practice had also evolved. I'd developed a specialty in conducting ethical audits for companies that wanted to ensure they weren't inadvertently enabling exploitation or fraud. It was proactive work, helping organizations identify vulnerabilities before they became violations, creating systems that made ethical compliance easier than corner cutting. The work felt meaningful because it addressed root causes rather than just responding to problems after they'd already caused harm. And it attracted clients who genuinely wanted to do better, who saw ethics as a competitive advantage rather than a constraint. Working with people who shared those values was infinitely more satisfying than working with people who saw every ethical requirement as an obstacle to be minimized. On Maya's first birthday, we held a small celebration at our house with Jason's family and close friends. The house was filled with laughter and warmth, with people who loved each other and genuinely enjoyed spending time together. As I watched Maya smash her first birthday cake, her face covered in frosting and her eyes bright with delight, I felt a profound sense of gratitude for the journey that had brought me here. Yes, it had been painful. Yes, I'd lost relationships I'd once thought were foundational to my identity, but I'd gained something more valuable. Myself. The version of me who stood up for what was right, even when it cost everything. The version of me who couldn't be bought or manipulated or shamed into silence. The version of me who knew my worth didn't depend on other people's validation. In the years that followed, life continued its forward motion. Maya grew into a curious, empathetic child who asked endless questions and showed early signs of having inherited both Jason's easy warmth and my stubborn integrity. My business flourished, eventually growing large enough that I brought in a partner and we rebranded as Morrison Chen Ethical Accounting. The Chen in honor of Dr. Sarah Chen, who'd become both a mentor and a friend. The workers' rights organization launched several successful campaigns and became a model that other cities looked to when building their own advocacy infrastructure. I continued speaking at conferences and universities, gradually becoming known as someone with useful insights on corporate accountability and ethical business practices. I never reconnected with my parents or Delilah beyond those final letters. Occasionally, I'd hear updates through distant relatives or former family friends. My father's health declined, though I didn't learn the specifics. Delilah apparently married someone she'd met in California and started her own small consulting business unrelated to events. My mother remained in the Seattle suburbs, living quietly. Their lives went on without me, and mine went on without them. The absence that had once felt like an open wound eventually became simply part of the landscape, acknowledged but no longer raw. Sometimes Maya would ask about my parents, and I'd tell her age-appropriate versions of the truth. They'd made choices I couldn't support, I'd explain, and sometimes people who are related don't end up being family in the ways that matter. She'd nod thoughtfully and return to whatever game she was playing, seemingly unbothered by having fewer grandparents than her friends. As I sit here now, looking back over nearly a decade since that anniversary party that changed everything, I'm struck by how nonlinear healing and growth actually are. There are still moments when something triggers an old hurt, or I catch myself seeking approval in ways that echo those old patterns. But those moments are rare now, and when they happen, I can recognize them for what they are, echoes of an old story I'm no longer living. The dominant narrative of my life isn't about family rejection or corporate fraud or whistleblowing anymore. It's about building something authentic and meaningful from honest materials, about choosing integrity over comfort consistently enough that it becomes who you are rather than something you have to think about. If you're still listening, if you followed this journey all the way to the end, I want to leave you with a few final thoughts. First, your worth is inherent, not earned. You don't have to prove you deserve love or respect or basic human dignity. If the people around you treat your value as conditional, the problem is with them, not with you. Second, speaking truth might cost you relationships, opportunities, comfort, and approval, but staying silent costs you yourself, and that's too high a price. Third, the people who reject you for doing what's right are showing you exactly who they are. Believe them, and adjust your expectations accordingly. And finally, the life you build after loss can be richer and more authentic than anything you had before. But only if you're willing to do the hard work of examining your values and then living by them, even when it's expensive. This community we're building together, everyone who's listening to these stories and recognizing themselves in them, matters more than you might realize. Every person who chooses truth over convenience, who stands up for vulnerable people, who refuses to stay silent about wrongdoing, makes it easier for the next person to do the same. We're creating new patterns, new possibilities, new ways of being in the world that prioritize integrity over image. And that work, difficult as it is how real change happens. Thank you for being part of it. Thank you for listening. And thank you for whatever courage you're finding in your own life to choose what's right over what's easy. If these words have reached you, please show your support by liking this video and subscribing to the channel. Tell me which city you're calling home, so I can see just how far a woman's voice of truth and impact can travel. Together, we're stronger. Together, we're building something that matters. And your presence here, your willingness to listen and engage and reflect, makes all the difference.